everybody. I am Thiamin DuVal, the Injury Prevention Program Coordinator at Safe Communities of Madison, Dane County. I will be your host today, sitting in for Carla Gaines. I am pleased to welcome you to the Ending Deaths from Despair webinar series. To our knowledge, it is the only one of its kind in the nation. On the behalf of the Ending Deaths from Despair Task Force, I would like to thank you for joining us and being part of the solution. The goal of this webinar series is to save lives in Dane County, help set a standard for communities around the nation grappling with deaths from despair, help us understand what underlies these deaths from despair, and to provide the tools to all workers who are trying to prevent these deaths. We are also here to lay the groundwork for continued conversation and action on how to make Dane County's mental health and substance use disorder treatment accessible, culturally competent, and effective to eliminate all deaths from despair. Today's presentation of the series is titled Harm Reduction in Chronic Alcoholism, presented by Dr. John Ewing from Meritier, UPH, Newstart, and UW Behavioral Health and Recovery. Dr. John Ewing is an MD of addiction medicine. Dr. Ewing uses neuroscience education treatment process intended to give patients a rationale for avoiding substance use and create understanding of how medication-assisted treatment and psychotherapy works. Along with Dr. Ewing is Ernie Stetenfeld as our moderator. Ernie is the CEO of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, Madison. He's also a member of the Ending Deaths from Despair Task Force and a former board member of Safe Communities. Again, I want to thank you all for being here today. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Ewing to begin. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. Today we'll be talking about how to reduce the harm from chronic alcohol use. So we hope to give a tour then of just exactly what is substance abuse. A lot of people think that, oh, if I only use so much, if I only get so high, then that's not abuse. But in reality, we think of substance abuse as using something to a planned degree of disinhibition or intoxication. People may do what their friends do, and harm is rare, but very often use is followed by not feeling very good. And so most people that experiment with various substances usually outgrow it and move away from it when they realize that this actually isn't that fun, because the euphoric effects diminish with repeated use, and with repeated use, those unpleasant after effects get worse and worse. So we can think of substance abuse as actually a form of self-abuse because the substance does not care what you do with it. So then we also use this term addiction, which we prefer to use the term substance use disorder. But in lay speech, many people refer to an addiction, but it's not clearly defined. So some people say that an alcoholic is anybody that drinks more than I do. And that's not actually very accurate. So if I declare something, I speak it slowly and clearly. If I've got good diction, I'm speaking clearly. And a dictionary is a book about how to pronounce, how to say words. So addiction means without say. So in a substance use disorder or addiction, your plans and intentions are repeatedly derailed. So addiction is the recurring derailment of plans and intentions due to intoxication and withdrawal. So how does this work? So this is our picture of the brain. It's upside down. Many of you may have noticed. Here's our little man in there looking at the visual cortex, the information from the ears. It's like a big screen TV, and we have the speakers up into the side, sensations roll across the top of the desk, and then the controls are behind the desk. And so we might view different ideas, and then we stash all of our intentions and plans in the frontal lobe. And what happens then is that when the frontal lobe is suppressed, our plans and intentions are derailed, and then habit takes over. So this is the basic mechanism of a substance use disorder. So what is at-risk alcohol use? It used to be men could have up to 14 per week and women only 7, but now it's the same. More than 7 drinks per week is at-risk use. And any more than 3 drinks per episode is at-risk use. So we have additional safety tips, and these additional safety tips are intended to prevent people from developing a substance use disorder. If they already have a substance use disorder, then they have to be a lot more strict than that or observe abstinence. So the additional safety measures: don't drink on an empty stomach, don't start before dark, never more than 1 drink per hour, and never drink daily or more than twice weekly. So these are additional tips to keep people safe from alcohol use. So many people think that these at-risk guidelines are a little bit severe, and it doesn't blend in well with much of our Wisconsin culture. So there is a different approach, and it's a sensible drinking guideline. And so the sensible drinking guideline is a maximum of 2 to 3 units per day for women and 3 to 4 for men. And then 2 alcohol-free days after heavy drinking. And so this 3 to 4 for men or 2 to 3 for women would be heavy drinking. And continued alcohol consumption at the upper level is not advised. And then some people who might be pregnant or operate heavy equipment should drink less or nothing at all. So that's the sensible drinking guidelines, which are not as severe as the at-risk drinking guidelines. So how much do people drink? Well, this is a graph that breaks the population of the US adults into deciles. And you can see that for the most part, most people really don't drink. In order to get up to approaching 1 drink per day, or that at-risk drinking limit, you're already in that 8th decile. And then you can see over here, there's this sudden spike in how much alcohol people are using. And we think that about 13% of US adults have an active alcohol use disorder at any one time. And so you can see that in this graph. So in England, we can see a spread of how much people drink. And we can see that we got 4.7 million abstainers, low to moderate drinking, and then heavy drinking. So this is how it falls out. So another way of looking at things is, what is drinking likely leading to harm? So 1/4 of the population in England drinks above the recommended weekly guidelines, and that is of the people that drink. And so there are 2 drinking patterns that are particularly likely to cause harm: binge drinking and chronic drinking. Chronic drinking is drinking daily or nearly daily. So a harm reduction approach is as effective as abstinence-only approaches. So we can teach people to reduce the harm and get the same or better results than teaching them abstinence only. So harm reduction is a practice that is catching on and becoming more mainstream. So what do we want to do? We want to make that sensible drinking message easier to understand and apply. We want to target the messages for those at risk, including the binge drinkers who drink, in the case of men, more than 4 drinks per episode, and chronic drinkers, that is, the people that have 1 or 2 drinks or more on a daily or nearly daily basis. And we also want to provide better information for consumers. So we can provide education in schools, and then we can work with licensees such as tavern owners to ensure better enforcement of rules on underage drinking and serving people that are already intoxicated. So unlike the abstinence-only or zero-tolerance approaches, the harm reduction model supports any behavior change from moderation to abstinence that reduces harm from problems due to alcohol. So that's the goal of harm reduction. We'll take anything that we can get that will reduce the problems. So people can generate their own goals. And oftentimes with a harm reduction approach, it's not so important what our goal is. What's important is the goal of the person in front of us, the person that our target is. So chronically homeless people with alcohol problems can generate a goal and achieve a goal. It has to be their goal. And the goal is harm reduction and quality of life improvement. We have to give up this idea that everybody has to achieve abstinence. And unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma to the homeless and the people that chronically abuse alcohol. And stigma literally means to be marked, to be branded. Stigma, stick mark. And so, yeah, that's not helpful to people that are trying to generate their own goals. So for the homeless, abstinence-based goals are not always considered desirable or attainable. So drinking and problem reduction are the most common drinking goals amongst homeless adults. And we can start by respecting their wishes and helping them to achieve their goals. So abstinence-based goals are not always desirable or attainable by the more severely affected populations, such as the chronically homeless with alcohol problems. So one of the big harms that we see in people that chronically use alcohol is poor nutrition. And poor nutrition can amplify liver and brain damage from chronic alcohol use. So we see liver disease, we see what some people call wet brain, which is where people have difficulty learning new information, and generalized weakness. So here's a diagram of the liver. The liver is up here. And the liver is composed of all these lobules, which make up these little hexagons. And then here's an example of the lobule. So the blood starts on the outside of the lobule and goes to the central vein. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, we can see, we got these blood vessels, and we've got all these passageways that carry the blood to this central vein. So what can happen is, if a person drinks too much alcohol, the alcohol can be rapidly converted to fat. And then these liver cells swell and they bulge into these passageways. So when the liver cells are full of fat and it cuts off the blood flow to that central vein, then the cells towards the middle can die off. And we call this at first alcoholic hepatitis. And people can see their liver enzymes elevated and sometimes might have some pain. And then it leads to fibrosis and finally to scarring. So in liver disease, we go from a nice, normal, smooth liver to this gnarly, nodular liver. And unfortunately, people will often develop jaundice. They'll get a big swollen belly, and it's really not very, very much fun. So trying to avoid this is very important. Another thing that we can see is thiamine deficiency. And thiamine deficiency is a type of, or can lead to symptoms of beriberi. Beri means weak. Beriberi means weak. And it can manifest as weakness in the legs. And it can also manifest as apathy and trouble moving your eyes. And in severe cases, the heart gets big and doesn't pump blood very well, and then people can develop edema. So we've got dry beriberi and wet beriberi. Now, what can happen with thiamine deficiency is that we can have what we call Wernicke's encephalopathy. So the person comes off the street, they've got poor nutrition, If we give them something sugary, then we can see this inflammatory process in their brain that can result in poor memory, confusion, uncoordinated eye movements. And if we catch it early enough and we give them thiamine, then this is reversible. And now in the cases where people have developed weakness in the legs and a neuropathy, it takes longer to improve. And sometimes the situation is severe or with recurring episodes. Then we end up with what we call Korsakovs, which is where people have trouble learning and poor short-term memory. And these people often require guardianship and supervision, and it can be a lifelong disability. And so avoiding this is one of the things that we want to do with good nutrition. So thiamine is found in the husks of grain and in enriched flour. And one of the things that happens is that when people start to get fatty liver disease and alcohol-induced hepatitis, their appetite goes down. And then when they start to get this thiamine deficiency, their apathy increases and their appetite goes down. And then that makes it more likely that we'll develop this severe syndrome, Wernicke's and Korsakov's. Another thing that we see on occasion with our homeless people with alcohol problems is scurvy. Scurvy often manifests as a rash on the legs, and if you're lucky, you might see these characteristic corkscrew hairs. So providing people with good nutrition goes a long way to preventing a lot of these serious problems. Now, what is alcohol? Alcohol is a 2-carbon carbohydrate. So this is the hydrate part, and this is the carbon part. Looks a little like a puppy. And so yeast digests the starches and sugars into alcohol. And if there's a lot of oxygen around, the fermentation continues to make vinegar. So how did alcohol get its name? Well, this dark eyeshadow is called coal. So there's another coal, the Kohl's department store, which comes from a family name, which is related to cabbage, like coleslaw. And so coal, the eyeshadow, can be manufactured by heating a mineral called stibnite, and then this evaporates and deposits on a cooler surface, and then you can scrape it into little jars and sell it as eyeshadow. So this guy right here at about 900 AD, Al-Razi, was an alchemist, and I guess he was pretty innovative, and you can see that his assistant here is a little suspicious for some reason. And so he discovered that you can heat wine and you can let it precipitate in a cooler vessel, the same way that you make coal. And so he called this process, he wrote a book called The Secret, and he outlined this process of alcohol, of wine. And so this is what led to the name of alcohol, which became a catch-all for anything that's sublimated, distilled, and now we just think of alcohol. We don't even think about eyeshadow. So typically you take your fermented mash or soup, you heat it, and then the alcohol precipitates in the cooler vessel. And this is how you make vodka. Vodka, vod is wet, and ka is small or dry. So vodka simply means less water. So there are a lot of myths about wine. And in fact, methus is the Greek word for wine. And the Greeks believed that if you had a goblet made out of amethyst, that it would protect you from drunkenness, and hence the name of this particular purple crystalline stone, which they call amethyst, which means without wine. And we can speculate and think that, these wine stories are myths. So that's where we get the term for the methyl group, which we'll talk about later. So why do people drink alcohol? What's in it? Well, alcohol disinhibits the release of dopamine. And this can result in a short-lived euphoric state, kind of a quit thinking about it and go. People lose their inhibitions. So it can dampen the effects of adrenaline, which in severe cases can make people lightheaded and dizzy when they stand up. And it also slows down the brain. So it activates GABA, which is kind of like the brake that slows down the brain. And it inhibits glutamate, which is kind of like the gas pedal that speeds up the brain. So the brain adapts to repeated alcohol use, and this results in a lot of problems. So we all have a set point. If it's too hot, we sweat. Too cold, we shiver. So in response to the elevated dopamine levels, the body starts to lower dopamine. In response to dampening the effects of adrenaline, the adrenaline levels go up, and then the person has more anxiety and irritability and insomnia. And then GABA sensitivity decreases, glutamate sensitivity increases, so then the brain tends to go too fast, and people end up ruminating and dwelling on all of their problems, frustrations, limitations, and injustices. So adaptation to repeated alcohol use can involve an increase in the number of glutamate receptors up to 300%. Now, the reason that the euphoric release of dopamine diminishes is because the excess dopamine results in dynorphin elevation, and dynorphin inhibits the release of dopamine, and it sensitizes us to pain as well. So glutamate amplifies the effects of adrenaline. When we dampen the effects of adrenaline, we end up with elevated adrenaline levels. So then during alcohol withdrawal, we have elevated adrenaline, which is further amplified by this increased glutamate sensitivity. And then people don't have as much motivation and joy as we would like. So this is how alcohol presents a false hope followed by sadness. So what is happiness? Hap is fate. A hapless person, somebody with bad luck. Hope is our desired fate. It's our idea about how things are going to be better. So if we are making progress towards making our hope happen, we feel happy. So as soon as we get there, we have to have a new hope. And that's how it actually works. So the substances of abuse all create these false hopes. And sad is to be full. Think about sated, satisfied, sack. And so when our mind is full of thoughts about our limitations, injustices, obstacles, we feel sad. So if it's serious, it means to be heavy. And if we add that gut clench of angst, then we're prone to anger and anxiety. So despair means to lose all hope. And so many people that use substances repeatedly, including alcohol, end up with this loss of hope and sadness, which we call despair. So again, you can see a lot of people, they followed a map laid out by many of the movies that they see and the people that they know around them, and they end up drinking way too much, and it's difficult for them to get out of this cycle. So the way this works is that the brain is like a hollow ball on a stick, and all of these ideas and memories ripple across the surface of this mind or the brain here. And whatever ideas, whatever impressions we can link together, that's what the mind is. And when we reassemble these series of impressions, that's how we remember things. So again, we view these ideas, we have perceptions and sensations about the outside world, and we gather the plans and intentions that we are hoping to execute. And the brain is wrinkled up so that we don't have to have such big heads, but it's basically a hollow ball on a stick. And the brain stem here acts like a flashlight. And when it's on, we're awake. When it's dim, we're asleep. So when we're happy, we get this extra light. We get this reward anticipation system switched on. And this extra light is what gives us happiness. The normal trigger for this is when we overcome an obstacle and it looks like we're winning, we're getting lucky, we're getting happy. And that's the normal trigger for this reward anticipation system. And all of the substance of abuse tickle that system. So if we look at a diagram of the brain, we can see here's the brain stem down here. These two structures here are the reward anticipation system. This is the frontal lobe, and this is the striatum or the septum. Some people call it the basal ganglia. This is where habit lives. Then down here we have the amygdala, which can send out surges of adrenaline. So if a surge of dopamine is produced, it suppresses frontal lobe activity. If a surge of adrenaline is produced, it also suppresses frontal lobe activity. And when the frontal lobes are suppressed, we often react out of habit, and we can go into a reactive state. Now, we can actually put a little tube right here, and we can sample fluid from this part of the brain. And when we sample fluid from this part of the brain and we measure dopamine levels, we see that if we give our test animal any kind of a euphoria-producing substance, we'll see this spike of dopamine. So then if we try to do the same experiment again, we get less dopamine, and then less and less. And that's because the substance might have that dopamine releasing property, but the body wants to be back in balance. So we have this opponent process that inhibits dopamine release. So then what happens is the first time that a person uses a substance, they get the euphoric effect. Then they plateau because this opponent process, the dynorphin, elevates and inhibits dopamine. And then when the substance leaves their system, they crash and they go low. And with repetition, in spite of large doses, they get a little tiny high, they feel normal. And then without the substance, they have this empty gray sock low feeling. And so people start out like this, looking for this high and willing to tolerate that low. And pretty soon, they're not really getting much benefit. They're just escaping that depression and that low. So we've known about this process since 1973. And then about 2009, we figured out that it's dynorphin that is suppressing dopamine release. So what sucks people in, if they're already happy, pretty good life, friends, family, they use the substance, they get a hangover, they beg off, they don't do it very often. But if somebody's got a hangover or they're depressed and feel isolated, they get the high and they think, oh, it's worn off. And they don't realize that, no, this is also the effect of the substance. And this is how people can get stuck in this loop of using. So the brain oscillates between the frontal lobes being in charge and on top. And this oscillation is like a teeter-totter between the frontal lobes and the brainstem. And when the brainstem takes over, we often experience this type of disinhibition, which is common to toddlers. So again, back to our diagram of the brain, we can see that when the frontal lobe activity is suppressed by adrenaline in states of withdrawal, we end up with this large amount of stress reactivity and these out of control feelings. So the paradox is that in order to stay in control, many people who are into using substances have to use them to keep control of their emotions. So again, this is the frontal lobes, which is suppressed during states of intoxication or withdrawal. And one of my science heroes, Nora Volko, has actually done imaging studies to measure the activity in various parts of the brain. So this part of the brain right here corresponds to the frontal lobes. And when we look at the normal brain, we can see that, this prefrontal cortex is in charge. It's on top. It's the most active region. Well, then during states of intoxication or withdrawal, you can see that this area is suppressed. It's not as active. This is where impulses arise. So people often act without thinking. This is the quit thinking about it and go. This is the force of habit. And you can see that the force of habit often dominates and has more energy than the prefrontal cortex. And you can see here the amygdala, where anxiety and irritability comes from, often is overwhelming and overpowers the frontal lobes. Then we have this other interesting structure here, the habenula, which is where FOMO lives, the fear of missing out. And you can see that this fear of missing out is actually also part of that withdrawal picture. So when people start out, at first they think, oh, this is fun. Yay, and I'm an adult, I can do this. And then they think, oh yeah, this is how you do it. And then you hang out with people that do it. It becomes a ritual. And then your other coping strategies fade. And then stopping use becomes perceived as failure, as dropping out of the group and being alone. Then you start to think, oh, I have to have this for fun. And then existence without use seems unbearable. This is the progression that we see in the development of a substance use disorder. So alcohol inhibits glutamate, disinhibits dopamine, and indirectly dampens the effects of adrenaline. So again, this adaptation, increased glutamate receptors, decreased dopamine, and elevated adrenaline can result in withdrawal symptoms. So when the alcohol level goes low and a person is used to using it, we have this elevated glutamate sensitivity, which can cause insomnia, restlessness, intrusive thoughts. It's almost like a squirrel cage of rumination and regret. Elevated adrenaline with insomnia, nausea, sweating, irritability, tremor, and then that low dopamine and increased pain sensitivity. So the stages of alcohol withdrawal by severity is stage 1, the shakes. And then if a person has a more severe case, they might have hallucinosis, they might have seizures, and they might have delirium tremens, which untreated, 1/4 to 1/3 of the people that develop DTs can die. So this is the usual time course of alcohol withdrawal. We can see here this bottom curve. This is stage 1 alcohol withdrawal, the shakes. And you can see that it peaks usually on about the second day. So we can actually use this then as a guide to teach people how to taper. So if they've realized that, oh, alcohol isn't working for me, I'm above the sensible drinking guideline and I want to cut back, well, they can reduce a little bit, not have very many withdrawal symptoms, and then a week later, they can reduce again. And that way they don't have as much of a withdrawal syndrome, and they can taper themselves off of alcohol. And you can see here, this red bar here, that's the risk of seizures. So people that are prone to alcohol withdrawal seizures, sometimes they can develop seizures 8 to 12 hours after their last drink. And then with DTs, DTs peak at day 4. And the difference between hallucinosis and delirium is that hallucinosis is the imposition of an image or sound on our perception of the world. Whereas with delirium, we're off track and we're not in the same room that everybody else is. It's like we're channel surfing, going from place to place. This is the thing that trips most people up, is this post-acute withdrawal. So in post-acute withdrawal, it takes 2 to 3 weeks for that dopamine level to come back up near normal. And it continues to improve months after a person has stopped drinking. So people go through this gray zone, this period where they don't have much motivation. And then it improves. This elevated glutamate sensitivity and also insensitivity of the GABA receptor can result in insomnia, restlessness, anxiety, irritability. And this, we think, goes about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way back to normal after 8 weeks. And so this is what leads to the binge and recovery cycle. People quit drinking, they stay off the alcohol for 2 to 6 weeks, dopamine levels come back up, they get their motivation back up, but they're still a little restless, still not quite right, so they go back to it. So what can contribute to that is the idea that, withdrawal is done, but you know what, this sucks. And people are still not quite happy. They don't realize that they're still in this post-acute withdrawal. So they also might think, oh, I was able to stop, therefore I'm not really an alcoholic. And so they go back to it, or they have this fear of missing out. And then one of the things that we see is this stress-based relapse. So when people are experiencing a state of stress, frontal lobe activity is suppressed, and people tend to act out of habit and reach for the alcohol. And that's why it's such a hard thing to deal with. And when you look at this diagram like this here, you can see, when your ability to make plans and carry out your intentions is suppressed on a regular basis from intoxication and withdrawal, you're not going to have much of a chance of making your hopes happen and being happy. So why do we think of this as a disease? The term disease refers to a dysfunction of the body's normal balance. So for example, you have a thermostat on the wall, you set the thermostat, the heater and the air conditioner switch on as needed to keep the temperature the same. And the body has a lot of different mechanisms that help to keep us from getting too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, too much dopamine, not enough dopamine. And because repeated substance use alters brainstem balance, resulting in an impaired self-control, we use the term disease. And so this out of balance state where people have difficulty sticking to their plans and intentions, that is a disease. And the body adjusted to the substance by pulling recipes out of our ancestral DNA. Now, the normal DNA has a methyl group on it, and the methyl group is oily. Oil sticks to oil, so the DNA will coil up tightly because it likes to stick together. Well, if conditions change, if we're exposed to cold weather or to alcohol or some other substance, we'll pull a recipe, a gene here, out of our ancestral DNA and start to use it. And if it turns out to be useful, we'll give it an epigenetic mark, which is an acetyl group, like a little bit of vinegar that likes water. So we might take the person out of the cold environment. We might take away the alcohol. This gene goes quiet. It quits being transcribed. But because this mark likes water, it doesn't coil back up. So the person has gone back to normal function, and their symptoms have decreased. But if they resume alcohol or they resume being exposed to the cold weather, they'll readapt much more quickly. So This is why alcohol use disorder is a chronic, remitting, and relapsing disease. The brainstem adapts to substance use by using recipes pulled out of our ancestral DNA. The useful recipes get that epigenetic mark, and that way we can readapt to alcohol much more easily in the future. So with abstinence, normal homeostasis is gradually restored. And then if you reintroduce alcohol, then we rapidly adjust to alcohol use, and we end up back where we were and even worse. And this is why alcohol use disorder is a chronic, remitting, and relapsing disease. So back to these sensible drinking guidelines. A maximum of 2 to 3 drinks per day for women, 3 to 4 for men. Probably really 2 to 3 for men. And 2 alcohol-free days between heavy drinking days. And continued use at this upper level is not advised. So, yeah, this is the important. Now, for the homeless population with alcohol problems, abstinence-based goals are not always desirable or attainable. So what we want to do is provide a supportive environment. We want to educate them as to the futility of trying to use alcohol to stay high all the time. And we can elicit the patient's goals, and then we can help them work towards what those goals are. So the chronically homeless with alcohol dependence need to be able to generate their own goals and work towards that. And stigma does not help us to make good contact with these people and share with them better ways to be. So poor nutrition amplifies the effects of chronic alcohol use. Can result in liver disease, in Korsakoff psychosis, where people just can't remember stuff, they can't learn, and they need a guardian, and then generalized weakness. So again, we have alcohol withdrawal, and people can use the information such as on this chart to reduce their use of alcohol, get through the withdrawal, the mild withdrawal, and then make another dose reduction until they're down to the sensible drinking levels or until they've stopped altogether. So again, when people drink chronically, when they drink daily, even in small amounts, they are cultivating this out of balance brain. And with this out of balance brain, the ability to carry out the plans that you've made and to stick to your goals goes out the window. So what we want to do is help people to have a better map about how these things work and how to get better. And when you look at things like this chart here, you might wonder, wow, how does anybody get sober? How does anybody stay sober? We are all human and we're all equally vulnerable. So what we want to do is light the path by giving people a better map about how to deal with their emotions and relationships and warmly welcome any improvement. We do not have to demand total abstinence before we'll consider them a human being. So people need food, they need good nutrition, they need shelter, and it's very helpful if we can help them find meaningful work and also meaningful relationships. So this is harm reduction and chronic alcoholism. And again, we want to emphasize these sensible drinking guidelines, really 2 to 3 drinks per day. And I would recommend never on an empty stomach. Don't start before dark, and keep it down to 1 drink per hour. And don't drink daily. So I'm ready now to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ewing. I know I learned a lot from that. And I believe we'll be seeing some questions in the chat. But can I ask first, how do you think we can best stop blaming and provide support for individuals going through chronic alcoholism, substance use disorder more generally?
So, yeah, there is a tendency to think that we are somehow better people because we didn't get a particular illness, or that, that won't happen to me because I know how to dodge bullets. Well, not everybody had the good fortune of a nice home to be raised in. Many people are exposed to trauma, and many people do not learn how to manage their relationships effectively and don't learn coping skills. And also, part of the culture here in Wisconsin is that this is how you fun. This is how you have fun. You drink. This is normal. And really, when you look at this graph here, you can see, no, it's not normal. And so giving people a map about how to be happy, how to have that meaningful work, those meaningful goals, and how to work towards them, that's a good basic thing. But if you look at what's going on in our society with the economic challenges, the minimum wage jobs, it can be very difficult for people to sustain that hope, especially in the face of all of the advertisements about how wonderful life is supposed to be. Does that help?
I think so. It does for me. One question I have about something I learned from your presentation about the epigenetics of alcohol use that I didn't realize, some of what goes on at that epigenetic level. An excellent slide. Is any of that transferable to subsequent generations?
So we have been able to measure the transfer of some epigenetic information from people that were highly stressed to their offspring. Mm-hmm. But that's a pretty blurry picture. And in large part, the epigenetic marks are lost when you make a new child.
Okay. What is the most crucial thing you think that you didn't get to tell us today, or if we saw more of your material that you'd care to have us know?
So, I think some of the most crucial information is actually the stress model of substance use disorders. That basically what happens is that a state of withdrawal is akin to increased stress reactivity. And when we're stressed out, we're not necessarily thinking clearly. We're reacting to our situation. And unfortunately, then people use their substance to dampen that feeling of stress so that they can stay under control. But then the body adapts and the stress just gets worse and worse and worse. Well, we do have medications that can help to lower that stress reactivity and that can help to decrease cravings. For example, during post-acute withdrawal, the brain is going too fast. We've got that excess glutamate sensitivity. We can use a medication called acamprosate to help dampen some of that excess restlessness during those early phases of post-acute alcohol withdrawal. And we have another medication called naltrexone, which is an opiate blocker. Now, because the body adjusts to things, oftentimes we end up with the opposite reaction of what you would think. For example, in order to, the body's natural way of dealing with stress is endorphin. So if I encounter an extremely stressful situation, my endorphin levels go up. The endorphins dampen my response to adrenaline so I can limber up and escape from the tiger. And it disinhibits the release of dopamine so I can quit thinking about it and run away from that tiger. So your opiates, for example, imitate our endorphins. And so if I give somebody opiates, then this same adaptation results in increased stress reactivity. And that's how so many people get stuck in opiates. Whereas if I give them an opiate blocker, it's going to block or it might temporarily block some of the endorphin effects. So then instead of with the opiates, the stress reactivity increases as we adapt to the repeated opiate use. If I use an opiate blocker like naltrexone, then the stress reactivity decreases. And when the stress reactivity is decreased, then the alcohol is just not as important. And so we can use naltrexone to decrease stress reactivity and cause alcohol to be less important. And it's easier, it's very often easier for people to move away from it.
Dr. Ewing, here's a question from one of our viewers. With alcohol so prevalent in our Wisconsin culture, how can we, or what educational or promotional approaches do you think we can take to this issue to help increase awareness, specifically here in Dane County?
So I think that the sensible drinking message is quite important. Let's see, sensible drinking guidelines. So sensible drinking, and also the drinking likely to lead to harm. So people are often unaware that daily drinking or near daily drinking is going to cause you problems. They think that, oh, this means I'm healthy, it's good for my heart. And it's like, no, actually it's not. Daily drinking is very deceptive. People think that's normal, but it's not. And so avoiding the daily drinking or near daily drinking, that's a pretty important message. And then also the concept of how much is a heavy day of heavy drinking. And more than 3 or 4 for men, that is heavy, or 3 or 4 is heavy drinking. Heavy drinking is not 10 or 12 or 8. No, it's 3 or 4 is heavy drinking. So changing people's ideas about what is normal is a good first step, because that vague map that people have in their head as to when am I using versus abusing a substance, we can clarify that with the sensible drinking guidelines.
And I expect this is an easy one to finish up with, but does it matter if it's beer, wine, or brandy?
So the brandy can hit your system a little more quickly, and thus be a little more habit forming. Wine is not quite as bad, and beer, again, is probably not quite as bad, but it's all alcohol. It's all alcohol, and the chronic drinking or the heavy drinking, the binge drinking, that's going to cause problems. So getting that message out there that you want to avoid heavy drinking more than 2 days in a row, that heavy drinking is more than 3 or 4, Actually, that is 3 or 4 is heavy drinking. And daily drinking is going to result in these adaptations that bump up your anxiety. And so a lot of people, they don't realize they're having alcohol withdrawal when they're having anxiety. So they think, oh, I need a drink to settle my nerves. And well, they would be a lot calmer if they weren't drinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, looking at the time, it does seem it is with the end for today. If there are more questions, Dr. Ewing did make himself available for that. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Ewing, again for being here today, as well as you, Ernie. This webinar could not have gone so well without the both of you. I also want to thank everyone out there for joining us today or watching recording. Thank you for being part of the Ending Deaths from Despair webinar series. We hope you attend future webinars in the series in the future and spread the word to others. Thank you all so much.